Is on your screen. He's a retired Drug Enforcement Administration special agent, also the author of the new book, Drug Warrior, Inside the Hunt for El Chapo and the Rise of America's Opioid Crisis. And Mr. Riley, in the acknowledgments page of your book, you say you were compelled to write this book because of the, quote, glorification of El Chapo and the drug crisis. What do you mean by that?
Good morning. I was somewhat troubled about all the time that so many heroic DEA agents and policemen and prosecutors spent to bring Chapo to justice. And if you go along the border in parts of Central and South America, in some cases, he's revered as kind of a Robin Hood figure. And the attention that he was getting, even in this country, was really getting my attention. But if you connect that to his responsibility for much of the opioid problem that we have today, in this country, specifically when you're talking about importation of heroin and now the more deadly form of fentanyl, Chapo is front and center on that.
Did you see that glorification that you're talking about continue through his trial and his conviction last week?
You know, I somewhat did, but I have to tell you, what I really, and first of all, let me make it clear, I knew the evidence, I knew the prosecutors, and I knew the agents, and I knew he was going to get convicted. But what I did take away from the trial that I thought was somewhat positive was I think the American people got a glimpse into just how nasty and vicious and cunning these major drug cartel leaders are. And I think obviously Chapo, in my opinion, other than Osama bin Laden, I think he's the number one bad guy of our generation, responsible for thousands of deaths. And his organization, as it stands today, is still responsible for killing people.
When did you first hear the name El Chapo?
It was in the early 90s, 91. I was attached to our Special Operations Division, and we began looking at Mexican methamphetamine traffickers, which Chapo really had a piece of. But what really got my attention was his ability in terms of logistics. He's a mass murderer of grand proportions. There's just no doubt about it. But he's also one heck of a corporate CEO in the way that he managed. He was innovative. He actually did research on the U.S. market to make sure that his organization could supply the demand. And we saw that really come to fruition, I think, at the end when the opioid crisis spread. But so in the early 90s, in particular, we were really concentrating still on Colombia with the Medellin and Cali cartels. So we were beginning to piece together just the evolution of the Mexican cartels, because quite frankly, up to that point, the cartels in Mexico were really not cartels. We used to refer to them as the Federation because they were loosely tied smugglers, not necessarily narcotic traffickers. They would smuggle anything they could to the border for profit, illegal chili peppers, counterfeit blue jeans, you name it. And Chapo really honed his teeth in his early days as a marijuana smuggler. So he was extremely attuned to the logistics of the border and certainly how to satisfy the U.S. market.
One passage from your book, Drug Warrior, just out. The passage reads, crime families in the United States knew violence drew unwanted attention to their illicit activities, but Guzman never shied away from that kind of attention and had no scruples about killing innocent people to achieve his goals. He built terror into his business plan. Can you talk about how you saw that when you worked around the country, both in Chicago and El Paso?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was the boss for DEA in El Paso, it was 2006-07. And if you looked at Juarez, which is the sister city, literally a stone's throw away from El Paso, it was aflame. It was a battlefield. Some at that time said it was more dangerous than Baghdad or Kabul, in which we were really embroiled in military operations. Hundreds of people were killed. And it was all because Chapo was at war with the remnants of two other cartels, struggling to control that corridor into the United States. So I saw on a daily basis, and it seared in my mind, the deaths that occurred on the streets of Juarez, the threat that posed along the border. And then moving on to Chicago a number of years later as the boss up there, my hometown, I saw what the prescription drug problem became when it first got attention, and then how Chapo shifted his business practices and actually stockpiled cocaine on the Mexican side of the border and increased his supply of cheap, very potent heroin that for the first time we saw was smoked and snorted. And that's an important distinction because we saw different user groups become addicted and get involved in it. So it's an evolution, I think, that he recognized long before many others. And when you are addicted to prescription drugs, however that occurs, either through bad prescribing from a physician or a pharmacist, or you acquire it on the street or steal it out of your grandmother's medicine cabinet, at some point it runs out and becomes too expensive. But you're still addicted to opioids. And what happens at that point, and it happened for many people within the city and even in the affluent suburbs, is you take that long road down to using heroin. And I saw that take hold in Chicago. I think the other thing Chapo did that got my attention was he formed really a toxic alliance with the nearly 100,000 documented street gang members in the Chicago area, who really were his unwitting salesmen, if you will, and didn't realize they were working for him, but in essence they were. They were putting the heroin and other drugs on the street. They were the ones that were responsible for the spike in violence and homicides and shootings as they began to protect their area. But Chapo was really pulling the strings from his mountain hideout in Sinaloa. And for me, I just couldn't stand by and do nothing. So it started in the early 90s. My kind of push to make sure that we kept an eye on him, because I really knew what he was capable of. And I was afraid that if we didn't do something, what he would become. 2007 was a tough year. I was in El Paso. I had just gotten there. And I had naively given an interview to the local newspaper there. And one of the things I said was, look, I'm here on behalf of the American people, and we're going to go after Chapo in Sinaloa, and we're going to do whatever damage we can, and hopefully at some point we're going to apprehend him. And he evidently took notice of it and heard it. And shortly after that, some of our Mexican counterparts contacted us and said that they had developed information that Chapo had put a hit on me. He wanted my head cut off. And I think it was for $100,000, which kind of got me mad. It was pretty cheap. But the point was, at that point for me, and even until last week, it was almost an obsession. It was my personal hunt to make sure that he saw justice, not in Mexico, but in the United States.
Jack Riley is a retired DEA special agent, of the former acting deputy administrator of the DEA, with us until the top of the hour at 9 o'clock. We invite you to join in this conversation as well. Phone line's a bit different. If you're in the Eastern or Central time zones, 202-748-8000. If you're in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, 202-748-8001 is the number. Also a special line if you've been impacted by the opioid crisis. That is a big part of this book and the work that Jack Riley has done. 202-748-8002 is that number. Mr. Riley, as folks are calling in, you were about to get there with the story about the price on your head. Can you talk about how you began this book that night on the road home from Las Cruces from El Paso to Las Cruces?
Yeah, it's unfortunately, and that's why I'm just so proud of DEA and the agents that have come before me now and will come after me. But it is somewhat of a dangerous job, and you kind of get numb to the fact that bad guys would like to see you hurt in your pursuit of bringing them to justice. But that was a strange time in 2007 because you had to pay attention. You couldn't blow it off. So shortly after we got the information that he may have put a hit, we were never really sure. You could never really verify these things. I was on my way home late one night. We lived in Las Cruces, which is about 40 miles up Interstate 10 outside of El Paso. And as I was getting on the road, I noticed a couple of cars sitting in a closed down fast food restaurant. I was getting on the interstate, and it was late at night, and they were parked, as I recall, driver to driver. And my first thought was, hey, they look like a couple of undercover cops, waiting for a call or doing their job. And then as soon as I got on the ramp, their lights came on, and away we went. And that led me on about a 40-mile high speed, just trying to get away from them. Eventually ended up in a schoolyard playground just south of Las Cruces, where I thought at that point I was in real trouble. And at the very last minute, they pulled off and drove away. So I don't know if it was intended to scare the heck out of me. or if they were carjackers, or I have no idea, but it's just too coincidental to what had occurred before. So that woke me up, and it really made me concerned, not just for my safety, my family's safety, but for our employees. Not just the gun carrying agents, but the civilians who are just as important to our operations, many of whom lived right on the border. And we even had some that actually commuted from Juarez across the border every day. So it opened me up and changed my mind about how we really have to attack these organizations, but we also have to put safety first.
The book again, Drug Warrior, Inside the Hunt for El Chapo and the Rise of America's Opioid Crisis. Jack Riley with us until 9 o'clock this morning, Eastern Time. Mike is in Laguna Woods, California. You're up first, Mike. Go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. It strikes me that drug prohibition is a foolish replay of alcohol prohibition, causing all the same social problems. High crime, you described them, it empowers the El Chapos of the world, providing them with billions of dollars. And instead of meeting, and it's been, I think, 4 decades now that we've been pursuing this so-called war on drugs. And I think one of the other things that occurred to me recently is that it's profoundly contrary, at war with America's founding principles. So may I have your comment, please?
Mr. Riley.
Yeah, well, yes, certainly. Thank you. I'll say one thing for me. When I hear the term war on drugs, it drives me crazy because that denotes a beginning and an end. And unfortunately, I don't know that there'll be an end to addiction and people misusing drugs, and then certainly the people that profit from it. But I tend to have changed my mind over the years. I would have told you as a young agent running the streets of Chicago that, we can arrest our way out of this. I'm telling you right now, we cannot. I think it is important to have a robust law enforcement presence, both domestically and foreign. And foreign is really important because we do a lot more than just narcotic enforcement overseas. We talk about the rule of law, institution building in places that really lack that can affect the security of the United States. But I also want to make sure you understand that I think we have to rethink a lot of things we're doing in the whole context of the whole drug issue. I think our education, the way that we're doing it now, needs to be really refocused on the most at-risk groups. It kind of gets me when a lot of people think the only thing we do for education is send a jolly local policeman in a uniform to a 3rd grade school. I mean, that's somewhat important, but I think we really need to work on our at-risk groups, especially with the opioid considerations now, which come from both illegal and legal sources. So that we attack the people, we get to the people that are most at risk, our young adults, our high school age, college kids, young professionals, people who are finding themselves in the grips of addiction. And we need to follow up with, I think, universal treatment for those that want it, that need it, and maybe it's not available or they can't afford it. I'm not talking about repeat offenders, violent offenders. I think those problems need to be taken care of within our correctional institution. And quite frankly, some of the best drug treatment programs are in prisons, which is alarming. So I am thinking differently, but I don't think, regardless of what we do on the legalization thing, and by the way, as I told Congress many times, I'm a cop. I don't make the law. I took an oath to enforce the law. So that's up to our governing bodies to change that. But I don't think at any way it would eliminate the black market. And we're beginning to see that even with domestic marijuana sales. You
mentioned talking to Congress, not Jack Riley's first time on C-SPAN, testified as the as the acting deputy administrator of the DEA before Congress. You can go back to our archives, watch that testimony at cspan.org. Thomas is on that line for those who've been impacted by opioids from Greenfield, Massachusetts. Go ahead.
Hi, how are you today?
Good.
I'm a little nervous, so give me a minute.
No.
I've been personally impacted by the opioid crisis on a personal level. It got me. It got to my soul, and I only used heroin for a small amount of time because of prescriptions. My doctors overprescribed me because of my tonsils being taken out. And I knew a friend that happened to be selling heroin, and he told me it would take the pain away. And by the time I knew it, I didn't want to take it anymore. But my body needed it. My mind needed it. And I'm so lucky that I had the family and friends that I did, because I found recovery, and I've been in recovery today for 3 years. I have a great relationship with my daughter, my parents. I got my life back because I had great people in my life to pull me back from that addiction.
Thomas, thanks for sharing your story. Mr. Riley.
Well, first of all, congratulations. I think what you've been through is a living hell, and the way that you've emerged it really, really gets my attention. You know, the Massachusetts, New Hampshire area, all of the East Coast has really been almost, for me, ground zero for the opioid problems. And there's some really innovative programs going on in that part of the country. I can think of several in New Hampshire, where we're really starting to see community effort to accept this as an illness, not a crime, and to make sure that we use all the resources we can to get people back who want to come back. And I think my hat's off to you, sir. You did great.
Your book is about El Chapo's network, but how much blame do you place for the opioid crisis in this country on overprescribing doctors, on pharmaceutical companies, on pill mills?
You know, I got to tell you, a story a couple years ago. I was talking to somebody from who was a rep in the AMA, the American Medical Association. He said that for years, physicians going through their medical training were given maybe 8 to 10 hours of pain management instruction throughout their whole training. Whereas if you looked at a veterinarian school, they received something to 40 to 80 hours on how to treat animals with pain. So I think there's an issue clearly with the medical profession. I know they've done a lot in the last several years to really try to provide training for physicians to use alternatives to opioid-based drugs. I think that has to continue. But you know, you bring up an important thing, and it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. I think the cozy relationship, unfortunately, that Congress sometimes has with big pharma, the big pharmaceutical companies, is really something we need to examine. Far too often at DEA, the great work of the agents and diversion investigators would look at these large companies, and in my opinion, I wanted the executives prosecuted criminally when appropriate and send them to jail, like the drug dealers I believe they are. But far too often we had to settle for civil fines. In my mind, when you're suing, you know, $1 billion corporation and you win a civil fine of $100 million, I mean, that's like taking a truckload of narco dollars from Chapo. It has very little effect. It's built into the bottom line, and it's the cost of doing business. But if we took one of those CEOs who knowingly and repeatedly violates laws or regulations, and we prosecuted him criminally, I can guarantee you a millionaire CEO in a Brooks Brothers suit's not going to do too well playing kickball in the prison yard with real felons. It would send a message across the industry that we're serious about it. So I think that's something we have to work on. Obviously, I think we have to work on education and treatment and kind of bring it into the realm of this is part of society's fabric, and we have an obligation to help those that want help.
To Camp Hill, Alabama. Bob, good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Riley, let me see if you are familiar with this. Back a few years ago, they run a documentary on about the pill mills up in West Virginia, the 2 drugstores, and the DEA was right on top of them people to stop. Now, they were selling 15 million opioid pills in a county that just had like a 7,100 population in the whole county. And Barack Obama pulled the DEA when they were fixing to bust him, and Barack Obama shut the DEA down, and he done it because he was getting kickback money from the damn drug dealers. He was a conspirator. He was involved in drugs, letting drugs kill 70,000 people in this country a year. He shut it down.
Mr. Riley, is that anything you know about?
I certainly know about the investigation in West Virginia. I think there's a more striking, larger one that we actually took care of in South Florida, where we had roving pain management clinics, as they said, and they would move from spot to spot to spot. And then we'd have people from all over the country traveling down there to get opioids, and then obviously returning home and selling them. So I think pill mills and pharmacies that are doing this are every bit, let me make this clear, every bit as guilty as the guy with a pistol and an ounce of heroin standing on the corner. So I think we have to do a better job legislatively to make sure that we've got the ability to go after them and to shut them down very quickly. One of the criticisms that we took was that we didn't move quick enough. Well, we can only move within the constraints of the law and the legislations. So I think that's something we should look at too.
I want to come back to El Chapo's story and his undoing. A passage from your book, Drug Warrior. Few people knew how much information we had collected about El Chapo over the years. We knew so much about him, his habits, houses, his inner circle, his taste for food and entertainment. Burritos and porn are what did him in. Can you talk about his undoing?
Well, you know, for the first maybe 15 years of his dominance, he really was kind of an old school trafficker. He stayed off the radar. He, for the most part, stayed in remote Sinaloa, ran his business from there, moved from place to place. But then he started making some mistakes, where he would come down to more highly populated resort type areas. Cabo San Lucas is one in particular. And he began, I think, thinking he was invincible. You know, he had a security apparatus that was probably as good as many, mid-level city police departments in terms of his ability to collect information and move around. But towards the end, he did have a zest, I'll say that, for women and certainly some other entertainment. And in doing that, he made some mistakes. I think what's important about that part of the book and what we did was we really targeted the people around him. In terms of the way they communicated, his doctors, his lawyers, his cooks, his girlfriends, all of those things were really important for us to try to build a pattern of life on this guy so that we'd have a better chance of zeroing in and working with our Mexican counterparts to try to hook him up. And indeed, we were able to do that twice.
What happened after the first time?
After the first time, he did what he'd been doing for 20 years. He used all his money, influence, corruption, and he dug a tunnel and rode a motorcycle right out. Yeah, that was the worst day of my life.
How did you find out?
There's a funny story in that. I think it's in the book. He'd been out for about an hour and a half, and it was about 2:30 in the morning, and my son called me, and he said, "Dad, Chapo's out." I said, "No, he's not. There's no way." And I turned on the cable news, and there it was. So obviously we started I called our command center. They called our then chief of operations, and the Mexicans had notified even our guys in Mexico for several hours, which I was not happy about. I think they thought they could apprehend him, or they were trying to figure out, quite frankly, what to do to damage control. But the interesting part of that is several months before that, I had traveled to Mexico. I think it was Mexico City. For a meeting, and I had an opportunity to speak to the head of the federal police. And about 2 months before he escaped, we were hearing some chatter, some information that he might be tunneling out. So I took the opportunity to tell the head of the federal police at the meeting, and he looked at me like I was from Mars. How dare I tell him how to do his job? And then several months later, out the tunnel he went. I found it very strange that they kept him in the same cell the whole time he was incarcerated, and it was on the first floor, which, if you put two and two together, of Chapo's history wasn't a good move on their part.
Are you concerned he might escape again?
Absolutely not in this country. He's where he belongs. That's an important thing. He and the whole, and I'm sure there'll be callers or people that will say, well, what has this done to Sinaloa? And we can talk about that if you'd like. But I think the point that we were able to not only capture him once, but build lasting, working, trusting relationships with some of our Mexican counterparts, which was a tough thing to do. And it took years and years to do. And then to extradite him, have him face justice in the United States, and hopefully get a life sentence, and then go to a place where he's going to have the rest of his life to think about it. I think it's worse for him than taking a bullet from one of his rivals, what he's about to endure. And for me, personally, I like where he's sitting.
Brockton, Massachusetts is next. Brian, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, Mr. Riley. There's so much I'd love to say. I first was going to mention going back to like the 1800s and the Dutch and American robber barons and the opium wars over in China, and how many people that killed back in the 1800s, and how many people profited from it, and how it's never going to stop, just like prostitution. But the other thing I wanted to mention was that the pendulum swings one way. A guy from Alabama blaming Obama in Tennessee as a drug dealer and blah, 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 and how much doctors were trying to help people with chronic pain. And I'm familiar with a person that's lived with chronic pain. It makes me think of the story when we were over in Afghanistan, and the Pakistani guy who had the 10 children and had to carry water to the well and was addicted to heroin, and how heroin is different from any other drug as far as addiction, and the stigma attached to that it's not like a physical choice that this person made. Hey, I need that drink today, or I need to snort that cocaine today. There's something that happens that is in no control, no choice. If you're in chronic pain and, like you say, you take opioids for more than a week or two, your mind chemically changes to need that drug, and that's of no doing of any person, any class, any color. And I wondered if you could just speak to that. And Pablo Escobar was seen like a Robin Hood, loved by his people. What else was I going to mention?
Well, Brian, you brought up a couple points. Mr. Riley.
I think you got a good point there. I really do. That's why, for me, the heroin problem, and now fentanyl, which is just alarming, 40 to 50 times stronger. It's a synthetic heroin, so there's no growing season, sunshine, or water in the poppy planting process. So it can be produced 24/7. It's also produced in China as well as Mexico. Yeah, I do agree with the caller. This is the worst addicted drug I've ever seen, and I've seen it much like everybody, just ruin and decimate communities. I think the important thing here is to understand it is now in every corner of our country. It doesn't matter city, small or large, rural or urban. It is a major problem, and we as a country have to stand up and take responsibility at all levels, because it's everyone's problem. It's not only law enforcement, it's policymakers, educators, doctors, coaches in athletics, preachers, everybody, parents, obviously, everybody's got to take a role in educating everybody about this, and then doing what we can do as communities to help the people that are unfortunately caught in it.
Patrick, South Carolina is next. Hank, good morning.
Yes. Look here, I wanted to ask you about all these enablers of Chapo, like these Oliver Stone and Sean Penn, all these movie stars. You know, they made him out to be some kind of big hero, and younger people look to them and think, well, you know, hey, they hanging around with Chapo, it's okay. You know, he's a good guy. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's an important part of how we find ourselves where we are. There are certain, for years I used to say, Hollywood can make great movies, but they don't need to show people snorting coke and shooting heroin, because it sends a very conflicted message, almost as if it's being glamorized. And I do agree. There's a part in the book about my buddy Sean Penn, and how, because what he and his actress friend did, meeting with Chapo, put many good, hardworking Mexican law enforcement, and to some extent some U.S. agents who were helping them, in peril, in jeopardy, safety issues. So I was very vocal at the time. I thought they should be prosecuted for obstruction of justice, but he claimed, and evidently, the powers that were above me believed that he was there as a journalist and therefore should be protected. So I just don't understand it. What I was worried about is exactly what the caller's talking about. It wasn't really him. It was the message that he sent by being allowed to do that, and then writing what I considered to be kind of a worthless article in Rolling Stone. It said nothing new. And his interview of Chapo was such a softball. He never asked him, is it true that you murdered 10,000 people and are murdering people today, and you torture them and you cut their heads off and you put their bodies in acid, and you kidnap young girls for your own pleasure? These are the type of people these guys are. And to even connect that with legitimacy, I think is a real mistake.
To Joseph in New Jersey, good morning.
Good morning. I have a question for Mr. Riley. I liked his take on the legalization of marijuana. I mean, here, this drug is considered illegal as far as the federal government is concerned, and yet you have individual states passing their own laws legalizing the consumption of marijuana. And yet the government nor the DEA do anything about it. I'd like to know what his take on that is about.
Mr. Riley.
Yeah, that's a great question. Frustrating. Let me clarify something, and it's widely misunderstood. DEA, it has nothing to do with whether it's legal or not legal. That's done by other agencies based off the science and what they would look at in terms of it helping, being a medical assistant. So we don't do that. All we do is enforce the regulations Congress imposes on us. But I do agree with you, and I'm still a firm believer. The cartels are still vastly involved in marijuana. At one point, I think it was their number one cash crop. I don't think that stopped. And as these states begin to wrestle with their own version of marijuana, I think they're under the false illusion it's going to generate long-term tax benefit for the states. In reality, if you look at some of the states, they're just starting to see the overall effect. Maybe they were able to collect, $1 billion in taxes, but what they're seeing in social services, emergency room admissions, loss of productivity, car accidents in Colorado now they're becoming, more and more people driving impaired because of marijuana. And then the other side of it, the edibles, the oils that are taken to be used, the THC that's extracted and is extremely potent. All of these things are byproducts of our decision, I think, at the state levels to make these laws and make marijuana available. I think it's a slippery slope. I certainly hope that if it's going to be done, it's done with the proper regulations and the services that require to keep it consistent with the law is there. For me, federally, we have criteria that we still go after marijuana traffickers. Don't think we don't. But I think there's always been kind of a misconception that DEA locks up guys sitting in their parents' basement with a bong. We don't do that. And we go after the major traffickers, the organizations, the Chapo Guzmans that are involved in this. And the states, I think, are going to have to really struggle with their decisions for some time to come.
About 15 or 20 minutes left with Jack Riley this morning. You can continue to call in on phone lines. If you're in the Eastern or Central time zones, 202-748-8000. Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-748-8001. If you've been impacted by the opioid crisis, 202-748-8002. The book is Drug Warrior, about Jack Riley's hunt for El Chapo, his 30 years fighting drug cartels. Mr. Riley, I did want to ask you your thoughts on what President Trump had to say last week when he declared his national emergency on the border, his comments about how illegal drugs are moved into this country. Here's what he had to say.
And a big majority of the big drugs, the big drug loads, don't go through ports of entry. They can't go through ports of entry. You can't take big loads because you have people. We have some very capable people, the Border Patrol, law enforcement, looking. You can't take human traffic, women and girls. You can't take them through ports of entry. You can't have them tied up in the back seat of a car or a truck or a van. They open the door. They look. They can't see three women with tape in their mouth or three women whose hands are tied. They go through areas where you have no wall. Everybody knows that. Nancy knows it. Chuck knows it. They all know it. It's all a big lie. It's a big con game. You don't have to be very smart to know. You put up a barrier, the people come in, and that's it. They can't do anything unless they walk left or right, and they find an area where there's no barrier, and they come into the United States. Welcome.
Mr. Riley.
Yeah, well, let's make it clear. I'm not a politician. I'm just a 30-year DEA agent who spent time on the border. Unfortunately, the statistics show that the majority of the drugs, heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana, come through our existing checkpoints. It just doesn't, in my opinion, make business sense for the large cartels to move the volume of drugs through isolated, unwalled areas. Now, I will say this. I do think the wall will have an effect on illegal alien migration. And I think, and I'm hoping the president does this, that if we enhance our technology and manpower at our checkpoints, I think we can make a difference. You only have to look 3 weeks ago, where at one of our checkpoints, the largest fentanyl seizure ever by CBP occurred, and it was secreted in a compartment, I believe, in the floor of a truck. And had we not been able to x-ray it, we probably wouldn't have caught it. So here's the business sense that a guy like Guzman put together. If we're only searching up to 35, 40% of the vehicle traffic, and there are thousands of trucks, buses, and cars that go in and out of the country every day, if they're only searching that percentage, and you're a businessman and you're thinking, well, there's a pretty good chance if I send 10 cars through in one day or 10 vehicles in one day, I might get 6 or 7 through. You only got to bat 300 to get in the Baseball Hall of Fame. On a business sense, that's a pretty good deal. Not only that, once you clear the checkpoints, you then have access to major highways, which is how you can take the stuff down the road. So I'm not saying portions of drugs don't come through unwalled areas, but from a business perspective and from all of our investigations, all the informants we've talked to, all the cooperating defendants, and even from legal wiretaps where we're listening to bad guys talk to bad guys telling us what they're doing, there's not a whole lot of evidence that high-volume drugs come through unwalled areas.
Plenty more callers for you. Ken is in Beaumont, Texas. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for taking your call. I did live in South Texas for about 13 years in the Corpus Christi area and spent lots of time down along the border from Brownsville to Del Rio. And the ferociousness and the violence that not all of it's reported down there. These guys will blow you away for the slightest reason. They're not playing. And so when we're talking about allowing these folks to come across the border, they're already here now, but to allow more of them freely to move in and out, we're inviting a cancer into this country that needs to be stopped. Mm-hmm. I fortunately or unfortunately known a lot of folks through the years, and most of them are dead, so I think I can mention some names. But a friend of mine was actually leasing airplanes to Barry Seals. When Barry would crash them, he would actually turn around and pay for them and buy another one and lease it. But these guys are working right here now, and the connections into Canada and to Miami, a lot of these folks are still alive, and that's what it's about. It's a dollar. It's how much can they get. And
Mr. Riley.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think he's exactly right. And that's why I think on the immigration issue, much of the border already has walls and barriers. So I think there's ways to do it, but I don't want to dismiss enhancing the checkpoints with technology and manpower. I will also say, I think he has a very good point along the border. One of the things we were always worried about, I was, for the short time I was the boss in El Paso, was spillover violence. And things that really scared me was a number of cartel people who happened to be on our side of the country, of the border, and were traffic stopped by a lonely deputy sheriff in the middle of nowhere who thought he was just going to write a speeding ticket. Well, lo and behold, you show up and you're dealing with these guys, and that's a fear that we have across the border. And I do think law enforcement in general, in many isolated areas, has got a tough job.
Nicholas, Pikeville, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning. I just wanted to speak about overprescription of drugs. My understanding is that policymakers have scaled back the ability of doctors to prescribe certain quantities of these pain medications. And I suppose if the patient needs some more, he's going to have to go back to the pharmacy or go back to the doctor for a subsequent prescription. I just think that this model could be used for many, many other drugs, because I believe that there's a tremendous overprescription of drugs. A lot of pharmaceuticals are wasted. Once the patient is given the prescription and the prescription is filled, he cannot return any unused medication to the pharmacy. It's over and done with. It's a tremendous waste. Perhaps the model that we are seeing in the pain medications could be used across the board within reason and save a tremendous amount of money.
Mr. Riley.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that DEA has done over the last several years is the National Take Back, where we provide, I think, the last, prior to me retiring, I think it was some 2,000 outlets on one day, 2-3 times a year, where people can return unused prescriptions anonymously, and then we destroy them. And I've often thought what the caller said was, well, if you were prescribed 50 Oxycontin because you had your wisdom teeth pulled and you only use 4 of them, what happens to the rest of them? And, our fear from a law enforcement point is they end up on the street. But the other issue is there ought to be a mechanism within the medical profession to immediately turn those in. And I think that's not a bad idea because it occurs every day. My father, he passed away of a pretty bad cancer, and he fought it for a while. And when he died, and he was a physician, and when he died, we went in to clean out his house, and I was astounded of the narcotics he had been prescribed over the couple of years that were still sitting there in his medicine cabinet. So I think that's a big issue. But I think that even the drug company, the pharmacy companies now are starting to get involved in taking back unwanted prescriptions. We got to be careful with it because we don't want to flush it down the toilet or dump it in the garbage because it can do some damage to the environment. And that's why I think these take back programs have been so successful, and we got to continue.
Kingsport, Tennessee is next to Ashley on that line for those who've been impacted by the opioid crisis. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I live in an area that's been highly impacted. I mean, this area has been devastated by this crisis. And what I've noticed, I've been impacted. I mean, I became addicted, and what I found was how hard it was to get into treatment. When I went the first time, they wouldn't let me into a rehab because I didn't have enough of a history of encounters of trying to, clean up. And I see that it seems anymore that there's not really an interest in treatment, but there seems to be more of an interest in pushing this message that this is a crisis, and they're using this crisis to push as an in route, and they're pushing as a way to get people on board with changing our privacy rights in regards to our health information. Because I've also seen reports where if it wasn't for the fentanyl, that the opioid, medication, opioids has decreased significantly the past few years.
Mr. Riley.
Yeah, I think the whole treatment apparatus in this country really needs a tough look, and I think needs an infusion of federal money to be dispersed. From what I've been able to see, again, I'm just a cop. What I've been able to see in areas that I've been impressed with what they've done community-wise is the local attention by communities or the states to treatment programs that are tailored for their cities, whether it be urban or rural. And I think the federal government can do a great job by funding some of that. So I do agree that treatment now is an issue, although there are some private equity companies that are beginning to step up again to make a buck, but providing pretty good treatment. I've got a dear friend who's a former DEA guy who helps them set up clinics and hard hit places. And it's made a difference in where they've done it. But, this also goes back to the whole issue between how do we provide patients with the pain medicine they need, but don't over provide. And so we've got to rely on the medical community for that. I think they're getting better. I think they need to do more. But I think what's really important now is you're beginning to see patients or even family members of patients who are in chronic pain management question the amount of narcotics that are being prescribed. And I think that's a real good thing, and I hope it continues.
Staying on that line for those who've been impacted by opioids, Jackie, Jacksonville, North Carolina. Good morning.
Hi. About a year ago, I was in a very bad car accident. My legs were crushed. The tendons in my hand were cut. And from the hospital, I got a 7-day supply of opiates. I'm not sure what kind now. And then from the hand doctor, I got another 7-day supply. Well, I had to take those pills, and I had to break them in half because I couldn't get no more. So after 14 days of breaking up those pills, I was only on medication for a month maybe. And since then, the doctors, I could never get no more prescriptions because they said they were restricted by laws. And so now it's either I eat aspirin all day, I leave all day, or if I'm lucky, a friend will come by, or I'll go over to somebody's house and maybe smoke a joint. Well, here's the thing about marijuana. If people were allowed to grow it and smoke it in their own home, you wouldn't have some of the problems that you have with people going to the doctor all the time, trying to lie their way into getting these pills. And when people really need them, they don't get them because of the laws that people make that they don't even understand. And it's
Jackie, thanks for sharing your story.
Unfortunately, I think, again, DEA agents are cops. We're not doctors. We don't prescribe. We don't diagnose. We just enforce the laws. But I do think, and one of the things I'm always worried about is if a physician is intimidated and he's not using good medical practice because of what he perceives as restrictions. I think that's the balancing act we have to do. And on the marijuana side of the house, I think it's up to the states to try to mitigate that. But the caller brings up a really important component. All of these things are interrelated. And until we begin to connect the dots and deal with the problem in its entirety, I don't think we're going to make substantial changes in this country. And I've said this for years. This is a marathon, not a sprint. There's no easy answer here. It's a violent, deadly game on both ends. And I think we have to really think what we do, rethink what we've been doing, and put the resources where they need to be to make a difference.
Two callers been waiting a long time to chat with you. We'll try to get to both quickly. Lee, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Riley. The thing that I'm concerned about, I understand this opioid crisis and it's killing all these people, and they're coming down here, getting their drugs, taking them back and selling them. But what about the people that really do need the medicine? I mean, they cut us off. I'm bedridden now because of it, and at least marijuana would help. I haven't had that yet, but I know it'll help me a little bit. I hope, because they cut the pills. I mean, what do we do? I mean, what's the alternative for the pain?
Yeah. Again, this is a medical issue, not a cop issue, but I will tell you this. I think one of the things that they are doing now, and I know some of the pharmaceutical companies are putting a lot of money in this, is looking for alternatives to the opioid for pain management. And quite frankly, for the last 50 years, they never had to. They never had to invest in that, because what they were producing was making money and, of course, getting people addicted. So I think now there is hope that there'll be some alternative medicines available that won't be addictive and will be able to ease the patient's pain. I just had a pretty extensive knee surgery, and when I came home, I was dead set on not taking the pain medicine they gave me, and I made it for about an hour, and I couldn't take it. But I was very careful not to go very long. As a matter of fact, I ended up getting rid of most of what they gave me. But it is a slippery slope, and the medical profession, I think, is becoming aware. And I hope there are some alternatives to controlling pain.
Last call before you leave us this morning. Whit's been waiting in Waveland, Mississippi on that line for those who've been impacted by the opioid crisis. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Riley. I wanted to say it's an honor to be able to speak with someone who has served their country so diligently for so long and was successful in bringing down such a violent person.
Did you have a question, Whit?
Yes, I did. Or actually a statement, just an anecdote about living with someone who was addicted to heroin. So I moved to Florida a few years ago, and I had an apartment, and I was looking for a roommate, and I allowed these folks to move in with me. And after they moved in, I learned that they were addicted to heroin. And it was really, really shocking to watch how they would constantly be in this position of not having enough pills because they would trade pills to other people. They would exceed their dosage. And so every month it would be the same story. They would start out in a good place and they would have enough pills. And by the last week and a half, they would start going through withdrawals. They would spend all of their time thinking about when they get to go see the doctor next. And it would just go on and on and on. And eventually I got rid of them because they were stealing money from me. And on a more hopeful note, I let someone else move in with me who was also addicted to heroin, but she was on something called Suboxone. And I watched her go through withdrawals over the course of several weeks. And she successfully kicked her habit and was able to move on with her life.
Whit, thanks for sharing your stories. Mr. Riley, I'll give you the last minute.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind words. And I just want to clarify, I didn't single-handedly do anything to get Chapo. I was honored to work with literally hundreds of heroic DEA agents, policemen, and prosecutors. And it was an honor for me to do that. I think what you're describing is exactly what a lot of people go through. And having witnessed that, you understand just the depths of what addiction can be and really how it can control people's lives and change their destiny. And I think that goes back to the complicated way we have to do something. We definitely need law enforcement involved, both domestically and overseas, which is really crucial. But we've got to really look at how do we identify and get treatment and help to the people that want it, the people that need it, and try to get the medical profession and all the other ancillary public service people to think cohesively on how to do it. You know, I heard the caller before say that she was in an auto accident. She saw a hand surgeon. She saw another surgeon, and they were both prescribing things. Well, clearly they weren't talking to each other because, and again, that sometimes leads to over prescribing. So this is a complex issue we're going to be dealing with forever. I think everybody that called in today has got a really good point about something. And I know from the job that I had that there's so many people out there in law enforcement risking their lives every day, and they believe they're doing it to help people. And I certainly did and still do.
The book is Drug Warrior: Inside the Hunt for El Chapo and the Rise of America's Opioid Crisis. The author, Jack Riley. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you. It was an honor.